For today's interview, we have not only one but two guests. On one end of the line, we have Neil Kramer, who is a philosopher, a mystic, and a lifelong truth seeker, which made him look into a large variety of subjects concerning the mystery of life. He was set on this path at an early age through several paranormal experiences, which made him question whether there isn't more to reality compared to what most people believe it to be. After a convincing demonstration of how reality can be tweaked, which Neil witnessed during his teenage years, he was hooked on figuring out what's really going on. He shares his insights through lectures, interviews, personal consultations, and his soon-to-be-released first book, The Unfoldment. On the other end of the line, we have Thomas Campbell, a physicist who got interested into researching and exploring human consciousness. In the early 70s, Tom came into contact with Bob Monroe, a TV and radio show producer interested in out-of-body experiences. Bob taught Tom how his consciousness can deliberately leave his body, and Tom started to map out the realms he found himself in with the scientific mindset he was trained to use as a physicist. Over the last 30 years, Tom developed his my big toe theory, a model of reality that unites physics and metaphysics and can explain the normal as well as the paranormal. Besides writing his my big toe trilogy, Tom gives lectures and workshops to share his insights. So, Tom and Neil, is there anything that should be added to your introduction, or shall we jump right into the first question?
Oh, let's get right into it.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. So the first question is for Neil, and it relates to physical laws. Are they rigid or fluid? That's the topic. According to Tom's my big toe theory, the physical laws developed as part of the rule set of this virtual reality that we are living in. So according to Tom, the physical laws are part of the evolutionary process and not a never-changing constant. If we look at Rupert Sheldrake for a minute, he developed his morphic field theory, and according to Rupert, physical laws are more like habits of nature, so they can change over long periods of time. So my question to you is, how flexible are our physical laws and those constants of nature really when we look at history in the really long term? And if these constants are actually more flexible than we currently think, what are the implications of this for our currently extrapolation backwards to the time of the Big Bang?
Wow.
In 25 words or less.
Fantastic first question. Well, I think that Tom's right, that the laws are there for a reason, and they're there to help in a way. And there is a certain immutable quality to them, because it's all very well talking in abstract terms about how physics can be easily bent and stuff, but then try walking across the surface of the river, or try putting a bullet in your brain and see how well you do. So there are physical laws there for a reason. I'm also quite fond of Sheldrake's morphic field resonance and so on, and I get what he's saying with that, and I think that's interesting as well. The way I perceive it is that this, what I call the third density experience, this realm that we find ourselves in, is it's a means of showing the effects of consciousness in a temporal zone, basically. So the whole mechanism of cause and effect, to a large extent, is to say, well, rather than having instant manifestation, rather than having consciousness absolutely sculpt things around and mold the clay lightning fast as it might do in a dream or in a higher density experience, let's see what happens where time is put into the equation, into this realm, because that shows you from a very clockwork point of view what your consciousness does to the environment, to the people, to the other consciousness around you. And as you begin to conduct that, as you begin to purify your vessel for channeling consciousness, is how I would put it personally, you start to see an increase and a potency in your conscious experiences. And from that first hint at thinking, well, what I feel and think and how I resonate does seem to have a subtle effect on the world around me, that first inclination begins to grow, and you realize that it's not subtle, it's actually very profound, but your perceptive apparatus is filtered against that. If you've been brought up in a Western materialist cultural paradigm, and as you begin to create this stillness, and as you begin to cultivate these techniques for moving your consciousness to a different state, you start to grasp the depth of penetration of how consciousness is woven into this realm. And of course, depending on your mindset, I know that Thomas will probably be more familiar with the works of David Bohm than I am, so I'm not going to try and expound all his stuff, but certainly from a physics point of view, I think that was grasped a long time ago in the 20s and 30s, and certain people have started to create bridges between those two worlds. My personal journey has been a sort of mystical one, really, and I kind of like went there by a different route, although I think the essential foundations of it are rather similar. And being familiar with some of the principles of Thomas's work, I think we probably share the idea that this 3D realm is really a developmental realm, and it's a place to kind of hone skills and to learn and to put oneself in a teaching environment where you start to understand the power of consciousness and how it can be used to create. But it has to be done in a very specific way, in a very specific realm. And so I think the laws of physics contain that until appropriate for me. So most people are subject to those, just as a hard scientist would insist that everybody is. The only difference in my perception is I wouldn't say everybody is. I say everybody is until appropriate, and then they start to bend, and then they start to change a little bit. But I think that is a very advanced state of being, and although it's open to everybody, it's a developmental marker rather than any sort of like ultimate final destination. It's to say, well, now you start to see the physics change a little bit. There's a certain responsibility comes with that, which is you don't need to go running around waving your arms in the air, or going on stage and showing it to audiences. It's a new mountain peak that's come into view, and as you go to it, unsurprisingly, as soon as you get there, you see an even bigger mountain range in the distance, and on it goes. So that would be my outline answer for you, Oliver. So I'll put that back over to you, and let's see what you think about that, and obviously let's get Thomas's feedback too.
Yeah, I think let's answer Tom first.
Well, of course, I agree with everything that Neil said. My perspective, the way I come to it, is from a different direction, but certainly, as I'm fond of saying, there is but one truth, but there are many paths that lead to that one truth, and many ways to see that one truth, many perspectives of that one truth. So I agree with Neil. Our physical rules fluid or constant? We have to realize that, and this you will find is all in consonance with Neil's discussion. We have to realize that there are more than just physical rules. There are rules that deal with our physical reality, and generally the science tries to dig these rules out and discover what they are, and they provide the structure for this reality frame. They provide we can say the rules. I call it the rule set, but it's the structure. You can't have a reality frame that's constantly changing, like one day you walk on water and one day you can't, as Neil was saying, and that sometimes things fall up, sometimes things fall down, and that would not be a very effective reality frame for consciousness to experience in. So you need rules of how things will work. Energy exchanges basically define the define the rule set. And those rules are kind of given, if you will, in the sense that this reality frame has evolved based on those rules. So we are a product of those kinds of what we would say physical rules, how this physical reality works. But besides that, there are rules of consciousness, if you will. There are non-physical rules as well as physical rules. And because this physical reality is not the fundamental reality. The fundamental reality is consciousness. The physical reality is just a virtual reality created within consciousness to provide us a place to learn, to grow, to experience, to evolve the quality of our being. So it gives us a schoolhouse for growing up. But there are some rules that have to do with consciousness as well. For instance, one of the rules of consciousness is that you, in many ways, create your own reality. And you do this in several ways. You do it through interpretation. You are consciousness imagining you're in a physical reality, not a physical being imagining that you have a consciousness supported, derived from the brain. It's the truth of the matter is just the opposite. You are consciousness, and you are imagining that you're living in this physical reality. So you interpret this reality in terms of your own experience, your own history. You get data. You think you get data through your senses, but basically you're getting data from a data stream into your consciousness that you interpret as this reality frame, but you interpret it personally. So we can change our reality just by changing how we interpret the data that comes to us. That's one way. We can change our reality because this larger consciousness system we're a part of is moved by intent. Intent is the fundamental motive force, if you will, within consciousness. And your intent modifies the probability of what is likely to happen next. So we create our own our reality in that way. We influence what happens next. But of course, what happens next, for the most part, will fall within those physical rules that we discussed, but not always. There are exceptions, and those rules kind of apply in general. When you get down and measure them, they'll always be there, but it doesn't mean that you can't, some people say, hack the system a little bit. You can do that. So we also create our own reality based on our interactions with others, how we act. Neil was making this point, how we interact, how we approach things, whether we approach from fear and ego or whether we approach from love and caring and no fear, no ego. We come from the caring side, the compassionate side. Then we change the reality around us. We interact with others. We help them see things differently. We help the whole reality frame change because of us. So the individual unit of consciousness is the fundamental thing. It is consciousness. It's in a state of evolving, growing up, becoming love. That's its purpose and point for being here. And the physical rules, though they aren't going to change much, they can change some based on uncertainty. Okay, now we can, in this physical reality, since it's a virtual reality, things that we, believe in, such as, let's say particles, like electrons, that sort of thing, the nature of them can change where there is uncertainty. The nature of our rule set can change where there is uncertainty. And this whole virtual reality is here for a purpose. And like I say, that's to give us a place in order to learn and grow. And as we change, as we as consciousness grow up and change, then the way the learning lab, the classroom, will also change too, to accommodate that, to make our growing more efficient. So everything in that sense is fluid. Think of this as a big simulation. How fluid and fixed is a big simulation? Well, you say you've got the rules of the simulation, things like gravity and so on. The matter, two things can't exist in the same place at the same time. All Newton's rules, that sort of thing. These are basic fundamentals of the reality that you simulate. But is it changeable or are they immutable? Well, that depends on who's running the simulation. You can go into a simulation and make changes as you need to, as seems appropriate for the simulation. So in that sense, though, yes, things are fixed in that we have a framework that is reliable. Things are also fluid in the sense that we are consciousness. Consciousness can change and mold and discover and become and be in its own ways. And this physical learning lab will modify itself as we grow and we change and modify ourselves, because it is here for our education.
Okay, thanks for the answer, Tom. And that leads perfect to the second question I had, which is for you, and it relates to the restrictions of the brain and the restrictions of reality, because you're just talking about changing reality, and the question is how far can we change it? And that leads to the second question I have. In our last interview, you derived how the brain limits the ability of consciousness to express itself within 3D reality. So for this question, I'd like you to go one step further. And in preparation for the interview, I asked both of you to take a short look at a video by Miriam Dario, a Dutch fakir who died in 1948. And in my opinion, he really pushed the limits of mind over matter to a new level and demonstrated that the rule set of reality can be cheated if you know how. And so my first question would be, what was your first impression when you took a look at the video, and why do you think the larger consciousness system allowed him to do what he did?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I did take a look at the film. I did not see all of it. You after a while tire of seeing somebody run a sword or rapier through somebody else's body, but I saw enough of it to understand what was going on, with no need to add to so if anything happened toward the back of that's very particular to your question, you'll have to fill me in, but I did see enough of it, I think, to understand and answer your question. Now, you say, why did the larger conscious system allow that to happen? That is really not the way it works. It's not that this happened in spite of the larger consciousness system and the consciousness system chose to allow it. I would say this was facilitated by the larger consciousness system, and the larger consciousness system created it, not only allowed it to happen, but made it happen. You will see all through individuals' histories. Neil mentioned it in your little introduction. He didn't mention it, but you mentioned in your introduction of him that he had some seminal experiences that showed him that reality was larger, that there was something else going on besides just this physical reality. Many of us have those experiences. It's common that people have things that kind of point them in a direction of growth in this area. If we look at history, we will find that these anomalies, that this fellow who could be run through by swords and not perish from it immediately, as most people would, bleed to death, or have his organs damaged, or that sort of thing. These kind of anomalies have been recorded all through history. They happen pretty regularly. Another one, and I saw right next to this article this little video that you asked me to watch, was another video on crop circles. No, there's another one. Here's another one of these anomalous things that happen that tend to wake people up. I would say that the consciousness system, the larger consciousness system running this particular simulation, is trying to wake us up. After all, our evolution is its evolution. We are consciousness. We are just pieces of that whole. As we evolve the quality of our consciousness, grow toward love, spiritual growth, however you want to say that, it evolves because we're it's us. We're all parts of this consciousness thing. So it tries to help us learn and grow and evolve the quality of our consciousness. And sometimes it gives us some encouragement. It shows us things that makes us see that there's more to life than just, the physical rules we know of. How could this guy do this and survive? How could those crop circles just appear there within a few hours, in the middle of the night, or sometimes even been recorded during the day as they happened? How could? There's lots of these anomalous things. They're there to wake people up. So I don't think that this person kind of learned to do this and flaunted it in spite of the rules and in spite of the larger consciousness system generally not allowing that sort of thing. I think it was part of a plan, part of a process of awakening people here. Now, you'll also notice that even though it happened, even though it was filmed and they said he demonstrated it 500 times, or more than 500 times, it said in this film clip. So even though that is rather non-contestable, and that is something that is really hard to just blow off and say, well, that it happened once. You'd say, well, maybe that was doctored. But if you have 500 demonstrations at various times to various people, and you have it on film, you'd have to imagine a huge conspiracy to write that off as somebody's imagination, or it wasn't real. That was somehow doctored and made it look that way, and that all these people who were sitting and watching this, and the people who were doing it, and the X-ray that showed the sword through his middle, and all of that, just really didn't happen. You'd have to be pretty foolish and pretty obsessed, I guess, with upholding the status quo to end up in that camp. But yet that happens. So here he did this. He did 500 demonstrations. It's on film. It's probably been on the internet for a long time. And yet, what difference did it make? Does that, when people look at that and say, oh, there's the evidence I've been looking for? Of course, reality is much different. It has different rules. These strange things are real. They don't. A few do. If we look at the whole population, everybody who's ever seen that or heard of it, probably 5%, some small percentage, actually take that and do something valuable with it. They understand that reality is different. They start then becoming seekers. They're looking for, how could this be possible? It is possible. I saw it, and now I need to understand it. And they start to grow and become. And I think that's the point. And there's a very large majority of people who aren't ready to take those steps, who aren't ready to grow and move forward, who aren't ready to make something valuable of it, and they just look at it, shake their head, say, I don't know, basically deny it and go on. They don't, it doesn't mean anything to them. They don't know what to do with it. They can't process it, so they just push it aside and let it be. Denial's probably a little strong. It's not that so much as it is, setting aside what you can't process. It's unprocessable for them. So that's the same with the crop circles. Here you have these things. You have a bunch of scientists from all over the planet, a group that's based right there in the UK, who studies these things, who goes out and meticulously looks for particles in the earth and way things are bent, and they have all of this evidence that they pull up, and they all come to the same conclusion, that though some crop circles are pranks and made by people, some are not. And some are just clearly unexplained by physical process, known physical process. So that is a similar kind of thing. It's a thing that is happening, and it's not that it's allowed to happen or whatever. It's part of the consciousness system getting our attention, helping those who are ready to grow, showing them that the world is a more complex place than they thought. So I think that's the point there. Now, what do we do with that? Well, with the fellow and the swords going through his body, most people just can't process, so they just ignore it and let it go. And then 20, 30, 40 years later, people look at the movies and figure, well, it probably was nothing to that. It's probably all made up. Probably never happened. With the crop circles, since that's an ongoing thing right now, that is not what's going on there. They say, well, this was obviously done by somebody, okay, because it can't just happen by itself. So if somebody did it and it wasn't human technology, then, oh, it must be extraterrestrials doing it. Well, you see, that's just another belief set. It had to be done by somebody. Humans aren't doing it, so some other kind of being had to do it. Well, that's just a conclusion that people come to. Much of this extraterrestrial stuff, I think, is artifacts of consciousness. And I believe the larger consciousness system is, you know, not only allowing, but encouraging, creating, you know, enabling these things, so that it enabled this person to have these, be able to have these swords through him. And it also enabled his attitude. It modified his attitude to where he had the strong desire to go out and demonstrate. I mean, why should he, having discovered that he had these capabilities, why should he have this passion to go out and demonstrate? So I see that that's all part of the process. In those crop circle films I saw, you know, we have one lady who was a PhD researcher there, staying at someone's home, and they saw this big shaft of light come down, and right where that big shaft of light come down is there's a crop circle. But then we had other pictures where somebody saw these tiny little pieces of light about the size of a football kind of flying around in the area, and then there was a crop circle. So you see, the process isn't the same. Big beams of light in one case that could be seen for a long way, and the other case, you know, little dots, in some cases nothing at all. You see, so it's not like there is a technology, a specific technology that's being used by specific individuals. There is a process going on here to help people wake up, to help people see big pictures. And most of the people can't process it. Because they can't process it, then they either say, oh, people do that out in the fields at night, even though that doesn't make any sense, because that would be impossible for people to do out in the night and not be discovered in hours of very complex patterns. But they don't know how to process it, so they just pretend as though it doesn't exist, which means they ignore it. So one of the questions somebody asked in that film was, how could the press, how could the people, how could the larger reality just ignore these things? I mean, look at it. Look at the evidence here. And the reason is they ignore it because they don't know what else to do with it. They're not ready to deal with this reality being any other than the way they want it and expect it to be. So that's what's going on, I think, with this gentleman with the swords, and that he was able to survive things that should have been deadly, with no you know, organ damage, or didn't bleed to death internally or anything else like that. It was just an anomalous behavior, an anomalous action. I mean, people have spontaneous out-of-bodies. People, I knew an engineer, and this engineer visualized, like in a dream, an airplane full of people, and all the people were in black and white except one little girl. And 2 days later, a plane crashed, and everybody died except one little girl. And it was that exact same kind of plane, and you know, the details fit perfectly. Why did that happen to this engineer? Well, because he needed a kick in the pants to get him going on evolving his consciousness, and he wasn't doing it. So he got something that would help him do it. Well, sometimes these demonstrations are individual and personal, and sometimes they're bigger than that. They're like men who go around doing 500 demonstrations of the impossible, or crop circles, or any number of probably 100 other different things that fit into the same category.
Neil, do you want to add anything to the thoughts of Tom?
Sure, yeah. Well, I looked at the video that you sent me as well. I think he's actually a Dutch fella, isn't he?
Yes.
His name's Arnold Henske or something. What I found was interesting with that, because as Tom suggests, there's lots and lots of these things that go on all the time, and these anomalies, I think, are there for a good reason, to show people that there's another way of doing things, and the reception of these kind of anomalies and phenomena and paradoxes is always tiny, really. I think you were being very generous, Thomas, with 5%. I think it's more like 0.0001 or something, but I get the point. Right. Yeah. So with this particular guy, I mean, what was most remarkable to me is that he felt the necessity to continually demonstrate this. And unfortunately, I've not seen his accompanying texts or discussions. I know he did talk about stuff. And I think probably, giving him the benefit of the doubt, he was more interested in the spirituality behind it. However, if you look at his case, he did die after swallowing a big dagger, which basically killed him. And I think that's interesting. That in itself is interesting because he did it like 500 times with no problem, and then he did something in the end that, you know, didn't function in the normal way. And I think you can look at all these things, and then the mainstream audience would say, oh well, in the end he swallowed a knife and died, case closed, that's the end of it. And similarly with crop circles, you can say, well, there was a couple of guys who got caught making them and they're all therefore fakes. And that, again, is an easy thing to do. And a lot of my work is concerned with what happens to a population who is exposed to like irrefutable phenomena, you know, real stuff that stands out from the normal rule set and is completely paradoxical to a normal way of life. And I think that reaction that mainstream audiences have to amazing things is really a symptom of what I have started to refer to as metaphysical conservatism, which is really a sort of state of being where people know in their hearts, I think, that there's a deep, magical, mysterious, amazing world here. And I think people also know that the 3D cause and effect Newtonian element of it is also only one aspect of it, even though intellectually and consciously they may not necessarily articulate that to themselves. I think there's a knowing of that. However, the dominant cultural paradigm, which is have nice things and strive for nice things, doesn't really have any place for phenomena. So if you come across somebody who sticks swords through themselves, and you go and see crop circles in England, which I have done many, many times now, and if you see those things, you have to factor that in to your own worldview. And if your worldview is, I want to be here and have some nice things, then there's no place for that phenomena because it doesn't contribute to that equation. It doesn't contribute at all. In fact, it takes away from that equation. It makes it more complicated and it calls it into question. So I think it is a kick in the pants for a lot of people to have something that is custom built, a custom built paradox that comes along and basically shakes you, rattles you. And it doesn't matter how old you are and what your background is and how academic or scholarly or linguistically capable you are. That's not relevant. This consciousness ecosystem is, of course, aware of all its own constituent parts to a degree, and everybody in the end can't get away with hiding under the bed, fundamentally, which is one way of putting it. And I think people think if they can get away with it for the whole lifetime, then the game is achieved. I've managed it. I've died in self-contained ignorance, success, and they wave the flag and say, yay. But again, that isn't the case. You can't really get away with it. The universe, the higher self, the divine source, the totality of consciousness, whatever you want to call it, kind of laughs at that. And I don't think anyone's necessarily punished, but you can certainly stand still for a long time and kind of stagnate a little bit. And it is funny when you analyze phenomena in people's lives, which I have many opportunities to do because I do a kind of workshops and one-to-one teaching sessions and so on. Obviously, I get exposed to lots of stories. People tell me, give me accounts of things that have happened to them. And one thing, aside from the wonderment of all those things anyway, and how special they are to those people, of course, is how custom built a lot of these phenomena are for the individual, how perfectly illustrated they are to knock that person out of their paradigm. And a certain type of event at a certain time in the life with a certain texture and a certain colour and a certain tonality, either to completely bowl them over or just to give them a kind of metaphysical shudder that they can't ignore. And I think analysing that, I mean, I could write a book just putting those cases together, but analysing that feedback element of the consciousness system becomes something worthy of our attention. And I know in my work I do this, and I know in Tom's work he does this too, but certainly in our day-to-day experience, it is a two-way system. It's not just this platform that you land on where everything's already agreed upon and nothing really changes. It's constantly kind of feeding back to itself. So I think that phenomena and paradox and anomaly and all those kind of things have a very significant and important purpose in the larger totality of the system, which is to keep this element of what perhaps Terence McKenna might have called novelty or something, or dynamism, this engine of creativity, to keep it moving along. And I think that also explains to some degree why it's always necessarily a very small amount of people who come to that kind of knowledge with any sort of penetration and seriousness. So we all do have these seminal experiences. It's very common, and I think everybody has them. The difference is between me and another person, the only difference is how do we choose to regard those experiences in ourselves. So do you just think, that's funny, oh well, I don't really know what to do with that, so I'll just kind of file that in miscellaneous and forget about it? Or do you stand back and just kind of tilt your head to one side and think, hang on a second, that is a serious blip, that's a serious glitch in everything that I've been shown. How fascinating that is, how utterly fascinating that is. I am going to act upon that. And whether that's good, bad, indifferent, some people do that. And when you decide to act upon it, it completely changes everything. And that's the reason, and anyone who's familiar with my work will know what I'm going to say next, why people don't do anything about it, because fundamentally most people don't want to change, because they equate change with uncertainty and uncertainty with fear and so on and so forth. So these experiences are transformative, and people are not comfortable with transformation. They like to have this traditional system where they uphold values from typically 50 years ago, wherever your time frame is, it's 50 years back. So in 2000, the 1950s looked very, very nice, and in 2062, 2012 will look really nice. And there's this kind of temptation to hold novelty and dynamism at arm's length and say, I know that's necessary, but I personally don't want anything to do with it. It's a bit weird and it makes me feel funny. So we'll let the crazy mystics and physicists deal with that, because it inevitably entails change. And those who have been saturated in the cultural paradigm of America and Britain and Europe, change is not a good thing. Change is a corporate managed strategy. It's not an organic divine emanation. So they don't understand it. There's a misconception about what change is. So I think even more interesting than the phenomena is our reaction to it and how we interpret it and how we integrate it into our lives. I think that is the teaching to some extent. And of course, first and foremost, you have to do that for yourself and your own application. It's really none of your business what anyone else is doing. But of course, we cannot but look at what other people are doing with that and contemplate why that is. And I think that's extremely instructive when we do that.
Neil, in your answer, you mentioned that you are often confronted with accounts of other people you are talking to. And for that. That would be a lead into my next question, which relates to performing real magic. And before I ask my main question, could you maybe share the experience you shared in your Walking the Sacred Path workshop, which you had as a teenager? Just a very brief thumbnail sketch.
Sure, yeah. Very briefly, when I was a young man, all those many, many moons ago, a lot of my knowledge derived from secret mystery school traditions, mystical schools, occult schools, etc., etc. And of course, saying that, a certain portion of the audience will think, goodness me, disgraceful, what on earth does that mean? And really what we're talking about is mystical knowledge from what I would call the ancient world, i.e. the world we don't really know anything about here on Earth. And certain groups have thought, gosh, this is important, let's protect it because it needs to be preserved, and maybe it needs to be only given to people who are at a certain state of consciousness. And most of those groups, in my experience, do quite a good job of that and do some good work. And it's only in recent times that some of those groups have been sort of compromised, so we have a bit of a negative view of that. Anyway, regardless of all that, this particular couple of people that I knew at the time were practicing magicians, with a K in the middle of that word, if you like, and one of them demonstrated a conjuration, which is quite a common one actually, that some practicing ritual magicians in particular will probably be familiar with, which is a conjuration of flies. So this guy produced essentially a swarm of flies from his arm, from his hand, and it filled the room basically. It was like, if you've ever seen a sort of swarm of flies in a hot space somewhere, they can really sort of build up, and there's a certain smell and there's a certain feeling associated with that. And it was funny that was more perceptible, shall we say, than the visuals. The visuals were there and I could see it, and that was obviously the most striking thing initially, but I could actually feel them and I could smell them. And then as soon as they'd materialized, shall we say, they went away again. They just sort of started to diminish. There was a slightly less number of flies, then less, and then you look again and they're not there. And I think the purpose of that is that a lot of these schools who have their own take on this knowledge, this mystical knowledge, and I very much agree with one thing that Tom said earlier, which is about one truth. There is one truth, and everybody's finding a path to it. Similarly, the knowledge of that truth, the reflections of that truth, reflected in many different places, and a lot of these schools and traditions will go along and find one path to that truth and think, this is a really good path towards the truth, and we're going to illustrate it and define it and articulate it in a specific way, and propose that as a practice, as a technique, as a set of disciplines. And I think that's how I consider these things. That's also the reason why I would never be an adherent of just one system, because it seems unnecessary to me. Not silly or wrong, just unnecessary. Because there are so many paths that the only real solution, the only resolution one needs to take is that you just do it your own way, and that's what you have to do, really. Sometimes observing other people's path and other people's terrain and some of the characteristics of that terrain, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, is really useful. So it can be good to tag along with somebody for a bit, but as any good teacher will tell you, your favourite kind of student is the one who looks at you one day and says, I don't need you anymore, thank you, goodbye. And then you have a big smile on your face and think, fantastic, there's an independent soul who has grasped in two hands their journey and who has gone forward with it. What you don't want is someone who wants to follow somebody for 25, 35, 65 years. That becomes unhelpful, to put it politely, for both parties, so you don't want that. So in this particular case, going back to this little episode, it was, I think, thought at the time, say, well, here's a young man who's interested in the path, who's interested in his awakening process that'll take all his life. Let's give him a little inspirational moment and show this. And now, as I'm sure anybody involved with Robert Monroe's work will know, that there's so many of these things. There's a vast catalogue of personal stories, really, that, you know, again, you could just spend hours reciting, and some of the most phenomenal, mind-bending things you could possibly imagine. The point of it, though, is not the thing itself, it's what it tells you about what's going on. So for me at that time, it affected a life trajectory where certain things that I was going to do, I probably didn't do because of that event, on reflection, in retrospect. So having had my worldview upgraded by that, I would say, rather than shaken, which is an attitude, that's all it is, I thought, wow, that is fascinating. I must therefore build into my life a certain amount of energy exchange, a certain amount of flexibility, where I can give time and effort into those areas of study and those areas of more than anything practice. So for me, it's all very well having abstract thoughts about things, but you have to put it into your felt experience, into your own life. So I think when you have these experiences and you embrace them as something to be treated as a sort of launch pad, you can then understand their role in your life. If you zoom out from your own route map for a minute and just look out and say, oh right, I get it. So that inspirational event as a teenager essentially made sure that a certain parameters in life were taken forward. So I didn't end up necessarily, you know, with a large family and lots of responsibilities and a very heavy workload, which would have been fine. And if somebody's in that position, fine, that's necessary and appropriate, no doubt. But for me, having flexibility and fluidity has always been really important in my life. And as I've met other teachers, certainly, you know, people much more senior and mature and experienced than myself, I've always noted how they too have that in their life. And it seems to be very helpful, to put it, you know, conservatively. It seems to be very helpful to have that. And some people are fiercely protective of that to, you know, very strange levels, which we won't go into right now. But I think that those kind of events, the purpose of them is to show you a life trajectory that is one of growth and one of empowerment. And that's why the Buddhists warn against these kind of telepathic and telekinetic abilities as something to get excited about and say, oh, great, you know, I can do it now, I've finished. They're really, really just the very, very tip of the iceberg. And to some extent, once you start to be able to do this stuff, as I said earlier, it brings a certain amount of responsibility with that. So to go around flaunting it inappropriately to an unknown audience is probably not a good idea. So I've always felt that the people who are kind of hovering 10 feet above the ground and walking through concrete walls and stuff, which exists and which I have personal experience of those things, they're not going to be putting YouTube videos out about that. You're not going to see them on the History Channel on a special program after the Bigfoot program. You know, you're not going to see that because it's not appropriate. In fact, it's highly inappropriate. So as your consciousness deepens and refines itself, you start to be obliged in some ways to have a more universal aspect to your consciousness, to say, well, this isn't just about me, this is about everybody I touch, and this is about all the other aspects of consciousness that's connected to me. And so you start to behave with this kind of universal responsibility, which is automatic. It's not about morals or ethics, that's nothing to do with it. It's just as you pan out, as you zoom out from that whole system, your truth has to encompass more and more truth. And when it does, it becomes more and more universal. So that means that you begin to respect other people's free will and other people's position on their growth, on their journey more and more naturally without even thinking about it. And that means, again, that those phenomena necessarily restrict themselves to the people who are naturally attracted to that. So if I give a workshop, people are going to be interested in discussing that, what it means and what it's about and how those things are achieved. But if I did a very mainstream interview on, television or something about, my book, and I wouldn't bring that up because it's not appropriate and it's not really going to achieve anything. I'd be more interested in talking about the psychological and philosophical aspects of the work because that's more respectful. Frankly, it's more respectful to what's actually happening here with the energy exchange between you and a wider audience. If I just wanted to scintillate people and sensationalize things all the time, I could easily do that and just concentrate on the sexy, dark, mysterious bits of my work. I could do that, but it would be very short-sighted of me and it would ultimately restrict my own growth. So I'm just not going to do that. It's of no interest to me. And you can spot other people when they do that. We don't need to name any names, but you can spot people who are wrapped up in ego in the work, which is always especially amusing in this realm because, of course, it doesn't take long when you delve into the fundamentals of how this place fits together before you approach spirituality and approach divinity, in my view. And to run around with an ego in that realm is rather amusing. So yeah.
Okay, Tom, any additions to what Neil just said?
Well, sure. I can actually take what's just been said and integrate that with what we said on the last question to see how all this kind of fits together. Neil was talking about how you how these things are kind of shall we say, self-policing in the sense that as you gain more and more ability to modify things, you less and less are interested in using that ability. These go together, but it's not just the individuals. It's all wrapped up together in one package. The larger consciousness system likes these demonstrations at certain times and places because of the people who happen to be there can benefit from it, as Neil benefited from this conjuring of the flies. But had this conjure of the flies had all of the major networks in the US and Britain there with their cameras running, guess what? Wouldn't have happened. Why wouldn't have happened? Because several reasons. We can look at it from his viewpoint. He would have been demonstrating ego about, look what I can do. Look at this amazing thing that I can do and how the amazing person I am. That would have been counterproductive to his growth and his ability. And then we look at it from the other point. I take all this and formalize it into a term called the psi uncertainty principle. And the psi uncertainty principle is there for a reason. It basically says that people are not ready for this. And as Neil said, they don't know how to process it. They don't know what to do with it. It frightens them. It's changed. It's places they don't want to go. They're comfortable where they are, and this would force them into a place that would be uncomfortable. Well, the larger consciousness system knows that if you force people to go where they are not ready to go, you don't end up with a solution. You end up with a bigger problem. So that doesn't happen. That's what the psi uncertainty principle is all about. The psi events can happen. And you think that, okay, they break the rules, and we have this rule set, and we're going to break the rules here, but they only happen in as much as they are productive and that they're helpful. Somebody gets a wake-up call. Somebody gets their eyes opened. Somebody is working on their skills or their ability to control their consciousness, this sort of thing. They don't happen as a in-your-face, look at this, to people who aren't ready. So we have this guy who runs swords to himself, and eventually, after 500 demonstrations, he swallows something pointy and it kills him. Why is that? Well, we see the same sort of thing going on lots of places. If you've seen the videos on YouTube of SRI, Put Off and Targ, when they did work with Uri Geller, and very tight protocols, where everything was doubled and triple blind and so on, and Uri came in and did things that had a probability that he could have done them just by accident of like 1 in a couple of million. But then we find later that Uri Geller, makes a fool of himself doing doing some things and discredits himself. Well, of course, that then pours discredit on all of the things that, he's ever said or done. We find that, some of the early and very accurate remote viewers, eventually they started remote viewing, alien installations on the moon and other things, which discredited them in the public's mind. So on. These things happen, and they happen for a reason. You can have a demonstration of psi in a sense that it helps wake people up. But when it starts to rubbing other people's nose in it who aren't ready for it, who aren't ready to be woken up, that needs to be avoided. You end up with a bigger problem. You don't want all these people who turn their head away from these things to suddenly be forced to realize that this is the way it works. You won't want them all out there trying to figure out how they can learn to make their boss give them a raise by focusing their intent, and how to make their mother-in-law go away, or how to hurt people and give them headaches and make them ill because you want to get rid of them. You don't want that kind of thing going on. These people are not ready to assume that kind of responsibility and that kind of growth. So the system will use these things as wake-up calls, but it also makes sure that it doesn't get out of hand to the point that it's credible in the larger society. So the fact that the newspapers and so on don't take crop circles seriously, or nobody really takes this guy who ran himself through with swords very seriously anymore, part of that is part of the plan. They don't because they have a kind of an inclination, if you will, in their own consciousness. It's like, leave that alone. Don't go there.
And isn't it interesting?
They get that message because it wouldn't be profitable for them to go there and grab hold of that. They're not ready to deal with it. It would create a bigger problem than it would create a solution. We think sometimes that, gee, if everybody would just wake up and everybody would just come and see this evidence and understand that this is real and it means that there's something greater than us around here, well, that wouldn't necessarily be a great thing. That would be pushing the cart out in front of the horse. And they're not ready. If you push somebody who's not ready for some information into that information, ready or not, you get problems. So the system protects itself and protects all of us alike as it creates these demonstrations, and it creates a situation in which these demonstrations only stay local and only stay, in the margins, so that the people who can get something out of them will get something out of them, and the people who would do a disservice to push that in their face never have to face it. So it's kind of just the way it is, and I agree very much with what Neil was saying. You have these demonstrations, and again, if you think of it as consciousness and our reality is virtual, and you say, well, how could somebody do that? I just don't believe that somebody could make a bunch of flies. That's a living thing with very complex organs. How can you make a bunch of flies fly around? That's a bunch of nonsense. That's because you believe that you live in a physical reality that is fundamental. There is no physical reality. There are no flies. It's just data. There are no bodies. There are no brains. There are no houses. There are none of this stuff. It's all just data. It's information, and it doesn't really exist. We just interpret it as existing. So if somebody feeds you information, if in your data stream you get the information, the smell, the sight and the sound of thousands of flies flying around, well, that's just information. That's not so hard to achieve. Nobody had to assemble biological systems. All they had to do was assemble the data that described what happened. You see, it's not you don't have to see it as that difficult a thing. It's just information. We are consciousness, and we create.
It is in fact. Sorry to interrupt. It is in fact, Oliver, what your website's called, isn't it? Matrixwissen, Matrix knowledge. That is, isn't it?
Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing, and it's a very good point, Thomas, if I may say, that you are talking about the manipulation of information at a primal level, and as soon as you grasp that, as you say, it's not so phenomenal to do those things. And I'm sure that the three of us have noted the great metaphor of the Matrix movies for some of this stuff. And once you realize the principle of how it works, inserting things into the Matrix and how people are dressed and what they can do and how they can move around and how they can jump across building tops isn't really that phenomenal anymore. It ceases to be quite the feat, because you're not treating the physical as the primal anymore. So you don't have to create that, as you say, that hugely sophisticated organism of a fruit fly, and then multiply it and then change the sort of thermodynamics of the environment to create this energy. You're not doing it on a scientific biological level. You're doing it at the primal level. So as you mentioned earlier, you're going in really and just changing a line of code just to adapt it momentarily. Mm-hmm. And I think once we start to perceive it in that way, a funny thing happens. It kind of demystifies the magic a little bit, but it also ups your game as well. It raises the quality bar, because, as you say, rather than people running around with magical abilities like in some Hollywood movie, you realize that isn't the thing to do, and that's not the point of it. And so there is an inverse correlation between the more power you have, the less you feel a necessity to demonstrate it. And that I see that over and over again. And the most powerful individuals I've met in this world, in this life, in this space, very rarely demonstrate it. And when they do, as Thomas has just explained to us very articulately, it's within a certain environment. And so sometimes if someone is going to do a levitation or they're going to move something, you can see them look around and you can see them assess what's going on in the environment. And if it's not appropriate, they won't do it, because they're taking into account the consciousness that's there, and they're trying to diagnose, they're trying to do a scan, a sweep of the consciousness that's there, and say, is this event appropriate? Let me try and have some part in that. And if it isn't, they just won't do it. And then if their consciousness isn't switched into that, as you say with this sort of Uri Geller stuff, your psi uncertainty principle comes into play, which is that the law looks after itself and just says, right, if this is going out to a TV audience, it's just going to be left with a question mark, which if you look at any program on mainstream television, they always end with the same thing, which is this: the announcer says, so we still don't know the answer, but we've learnt some new things. And it always ends in that way. There's never any conclusions, there's never any stamps of resolution at all. And for the wise man and woman, that's okay. And you start to realize why that is, and you start to propel yourself away from the mainstream core, because you know that all the interesting stuff happens on the sort of pioneering fringe. And so necessarily you always move yourself to that edge, because that's where the exciting, real, fascinating stuff is emerging. And so if you live in the mainstream core, you're not going to be exposed to that. And relatively speaking, what's happening on the fringe isn't relevant to you, and that's okay as well.
Sure. We'll see, just take these crop circles, for example. If they get to be taken very seriously in the larger society, one of two things will happen. One, they will stop. You won't have any more crop circles, or they will get very few and far between. Or certain things will happen, like suddenly a bunch of people will be motivated to go out and make crop circles. They will be discovered, and that will discredit it. So the low profile will be maintained one way or another. So as long as they are in the margin, then they can stay just the way they are. Matter of fact, they could even turn the gain up a little bit. Now, if they get to where they start to get out of the margin, the gain will be turned down. And that's the way these things work. They're there as a demonstration, and they're not there to force people to see something they're not ready to see.
And don't you find it interesting, Thomas, that as we've said all this, that some people are ready, some people aren't, and as you get closer to that phenomenon, you start to see the principle and see the wisdom in that. It is always amusing to me, and I say that, not egotistically, I mean just purely it is amusing to see campaigners who are absolutely focused on disclosing something or exposing something or getting whole groups of people to try and prove something to them. And I kind of look at these guys, and it is generally men. Women don't seem to have quite the same compulsion to do this very wisely, but I look at some of these guys and think, why are you doing that? I think what's more important than what you're actually trying to prove is why you're trying to prove it. And I think if they follow that trail of evidence, shall we say, it leads to like quite a personal spiritual question, which is highly relevant and highly important. And so ironically, it sometimes means that you leave them to it. You leave them to their own discovery.
Oh, yes. I think sometimes these folks are driven to do what they do. They get obsessed by it just because the system feels that they need to turn the gain down a little bit. And so these guys get turned up a little bit so that they holler fraud and, nobody can prove it and so on. And after they rant and rave a little bit, that turns the gain down to where it's more optimal. And then life goes on. So, sometimes they're not just spoilers and troublemakers and people that are making it difficult for the rest of us. Sometimes, I see them as a necessary part of the whole as well.
They are.
They're part of the balance. They're not. You can get kind of upset with them, I guess. Sometimes they say things that are ridiculous, but they're part of the balance. That's necessary as well, as this whole learning lab that we're in needs to be optimized. You can't, you can't just push ahead and force everybody to see something and expect that that's going to have a wonderful result. It's not.
It's not, and I think it is curious that when you do see someone who is pursuing something of a phenomenal nature in the true sense of the word, or certainly an esoteric thing. I went to a conference in 2009 in Liverpool in England, and there was a sort of UFO flavour to part of it. There were a number of speakers, and one guy in particular there was absolutely committed to disclosing the reality and the truth of extraterrestrial contact. And he was, really dedicating every waking minute to this thing, and you could see it in his eyes, and he had these big bags under his eyes, and he seemed frantic and anxious all the time and stuff. And I just kind of like looked at him and just thought, well, I don't really think you need to do that because it doesn't really serve any purpose for you. It should be just a very personal encounter. You should be quite happy with that. And of course, you wouldn't necessarily say that to somebody, but then I stood back and thought, no, actually, that's wrong. You're doing exactly what you need to do right now, and you're serving a certain role, which we mustn't be necessarily disrespectful of and assume that we know better. Not at all. To some extent, a lot of people do need proof, and they need these figureheads who will say, well, let's look at the evidence, let's examine data, place it side by side, compare it, contrast it, and so on. Personally, I've never ever felt the need to prove anything for myself or for anyone else. I just feel the truth of a thing through direct experience, and it's extremely unscientific how I go about my stuff. However, I've found it advantageous to bring more scientific nature of analysis into what I do, because as I've gone along, I've found that some of the people who listen to what I say, that's helpful. That helps them conceptualize it and consider it in a more balanced way. So sometimes it becomes useful to build up a bit of a sort of multiple skill set to say, depending on what you're doing and depending on who you're talking to, it can be useful to have a spiritual tone or a scientific tone, or to have some sort of psychological reference points, or to speak with humor, and to realize that having an entertainment value doesn't necessarily cheapen what you're doing. It entertains people to the point where you bring them to the edge of this vista, this panorama that you want to show them, and say, well, I've brought you here, I've snuck you in through humor, and now you stand there and you look at that and think about what that means. And so, particularly with the comedian Bill Hicks, he was an out-and-out stand-up comedian, and yet if you look at the content of his work, in the 90s, he was talking about metaphysics, he was talking about ethnobotany, he was talking about conspiracy, he was talking about freedom, civil liberties, choice, artistry, really important, fascinating topics, but they were all clothed, they were all robed in humor. And I bet that a lot of people who went along just to have a few beers and a few laughs at a Bill Hicks show went away on the first steps of a vast and mystical spiritual journey. So there isn't necessarily one way of dressing wisdom and spiritual truth. It is everywhere all the time, really. And even the guys who do it in a way that I personally would think, well, I would never do it that way. I respect that they have a role to play and they address a certain part of the system. And they're also, first and foremost, also on their own spiritual journey. And if they need to realize that being a campaigner isn't actually necessary, then that's the part of the journey that they're on, and you don't want to mess that up for them. You leave them to their own realization.
Yes, absolutely. Just like the Dutchman who had to demonstrate this 500 or more times, that he was, yeah. I'd say he was driven to do that just because, he was given that ability and then kind of pushed to show it off. And just as well, he was made to disappear when it got to be a little too much.
I know.
So it just, the whole thing, you have to look at reality and what's going on here from a big picture. You have to see it from the whole. Like I was talking to somebody in an interview the other day, and they were saying, I have some friends, and they're so discouraged. They've been in this consciousness expansion and growth and spirituality, and they've been doing this and preaching it and going about it for a decade now, and they just don't see that it's making any difference. The world's still, you pick up the newspaper and it still looks the same as it did before. They're just very discouraged that it's not working, and they're about ready to quit and so on. And it's like, well, it's not about them changing the world. It's about them just doing their own part, and let the world integrate that and take it as it will. You just do your part, and you don't need to have that result of a big prize at the end. You shouldn't be working for the prize. You should be working just to improve yourself, just to grow up. And as you grow up, you will help bring the whole into a better alignment and into a better place. But if you're working just to bring the whole into a better place without actually growing up, then you're either going to be ineffective, or what you do is going to be part of the problem as opposed to part of the solution. So we don't need to see that we are changing the world so much as we need to change ourselves, which will in turn change the world, and let all that take place as it does in its own time.
And I think that's a fundamental realization which you can read about in the oneness of everything, and we're all one, and it's all one system flowing, interpenetrating each other. And I read that when I was 15 and saw that and thought, yeah, that's really good. Anyway, it took another 20 years, really, before I actually understood what the hell that meant. And it took another bunch of years on top of that to then bring that into experience, into life, or as I like to say, into the grocery store or when I was brushing my teeth. I need to bring that stuff into felt experience. And I think that's one of the issues, that people do live in a state of separateness. And when you do that, you inevitably start to make mistakes, and you start to think that, well, just working on myself is somehow selfish. But if you realize that it is a wholeness, it is a holistic system, and it is a deeply, deeply interconnected kind of membrane, if you like, a fourth dimensional membrane that just emanates, then you can say, well, in that case, if I consolidate my knowledge, and if I grow, and if I refine what I'm doing and make it more graceful and elegant, that actually affects everything then, doesn't it? And he says, well, yeah, because you're connected to everything. So the power and the resonance with which you do that will determine the breadth and the depth of that resonance. And it's also brilliantly put together because it will affect the people who are ready for it most first. And you magnetize people to you who you can teach and who you can learn from. So in my work, again, one cannot help but note that when you're dealing with people, you remark on how incredible it is, the synchronicities with what they teach you that day, even just in passing conversation. And I just think, well, that is so perfectly aligned with where I'm at right now. And that knowledge has never come to me in any way, shape or form before. And so there is a very specific structure to this, where you magnetize what's appropriate at the time that it happens. And so if there is, sometimes, again, it's curious, it's odd, in fact, to know the extreme contrast between self-aware, spiritually aligned people who are talking about the kind of things that we're talking about, and people who do not do any of those things. And yesterday, as an example, I was sat in a coffee shop over here in Oregon with my little computer, just having a coffee, putting some notes together for a presentation next month. And I was kind of researching some stuff and talking about all this, very clever and metaphysically fascinating stuff, and thinking, how can I put this forward to the audience that will engage them, and let me try and do this differently, and I'll build that in and I'll do this. And then some people sat at the table next to me, and they were kind of just talking about, the gas prices have gone up, and there's a new pie in the shop on the corner, and the cherries are like really nice. And they were talking about a completely different aspect, a completely different layer of reality. And yet it struck me that it was no less or more real than what I was doing. And in fact, my contemplations were more abstracted than theirs were to some extent. And I think that's part of the teaching of universal truth, which is that you don't assume that because you're on the spiritual path, as we might say, that there's something special about that. The only thing that's special about it is that it's always a low number of people who are aware that that's going on. Everybody, you could say, is on a spiritual path, but when you become conscious of it, you become a minority, and there's no denying that, really, because most people are not interested in that stuff. And yet, from this vantage point, as you say, always taking the bigger picture, the big view, you can look upon those people and think, this is your spiritual path. And the fact that you're not consciously articulating that in your thoughts and in your deeds doesn't matter, quite frankly, right now. It doesn't matter. The only thing that is a good idea is to bring this, as we quite popularly say nowadays, this authenticity into what we do and into how we are and into what we bring to our lives. So always, for me, a lot of the things we're talking about, particularly with phenomena and matrix wizardry is to say, well, how can you integrate that into your everyday life? Because for me, if it's entirely separate and they're just nice thoughts that are kind of interesting, then the relevance is questionable. For me, it has to be something that you can literally walk into everyday experiences, and that's the intrigue and the pleasure of this path for me, is the integration of those things and bringing it into the experiences that you physically have. Because although I absolutely agree, Thomas, with your sort of view that this is data, essentially it's little bits of information wiggling around and we construct it as mental model of the world. It's necessarily a model that we have to reference, and so it's real because of its consistency, really, I would say, and that's what marks it out as a compelling model, and that's what people call real. That concreteness is that consistency. And as I sometimes say to people, the only difference between the dream I had last night and this dream is that this dream here that we all kind of like experience is very consistent, and it persists and it endures and it looks very similar from one day to the next. But it is a training mechanism, and part of that training is to understand that awareness is quite a precious gift, and it is something to be treated with a bit of grace and a bit of reverence, because it is the foundation of the whole thing. And as you move closer to that, I think you do start to shift density, and that's a very personal journey. But there do seem to be these tidal flows of it as well. So I do think that there's also an awakening process that is accelerating a little bit. So that tiny percentage is just bumped up a little bit on the world grid. And I've never met so many conscious, engaged people before, and I think that's quite unusual. And even 20 years ago, that was kind of low. There was a lot of people talking about it, and also in the last 18 months, meeting young people like in the 20s who are really aware and really engaged. They're not just talking about certain books and certain people and throwing buzzwords around. They're actually doing it. They're actually walking the talk. That, I think, is very encouraging. So while we can see that the mainstream isn't there, if you go to conferences and workshops and write books and stuff, you're going to engage with another subculture who are existing and resonating closer to the fringe, closer to the developmental edge. And I think that's necessarily the way it has to be, and I think that's okay.
Yeah, well, not only okay, but necessary.
Yeah.
It has to be. It has to be that way. We are evolving, and evolution doesn't skip steps. So people are where they need to be. They are right at the level of challenge, where that challenge can be met and end up as knowledge.
And you have to respect that, don't you? Because
and that's just the way it is. Yeah, they can't. I mean, we don't look at 3-year-old children and say mean things about them because they don't act like adults. We say, well, they are as they are. They're in a process, and they're growing. And one day they will be adults, but right now they are who they are. And it's not like that's something inferior or that the children are lesser beings. They just are in a process. And part of that, and they have to be at that point. They can't skip the process of childhood. They have to grow up. So it's necessary. One of the ways I describe what you were talking about, I talk about awareness at the being level and awareness at the intellectual level, which is pretty much what you were saying there. You have awareness at the being level. It means it's integrated into your core. It's part of your being. It's a fundamental part of your consciousness. Where you have awareness at the intellectual level means you know the buzzwords, you can discuss the issue, you kind of understand the structure, but that's very different than absorbing that information down at the being level. At the intellectual level, you can read the most Weis of writings. You can read the books that have all the important things in them, and it really won't make a bit of difference. You'll be able to discuss them at a cocktail party, but they won't affect your life until you transfer them into the awareness at the being level, at your core. But you got to start someplace, and often people start with the intellect. The intellect leads sometimes, and then the rest of it builds slowly as understanding seeps deeper. But all of this is as it has to be. We're in a learning lab. We have lots of different consciousness here, and they're all evolving in their own way, at their own right. I mean, in their own time, and that's the way it has to be. There's no way that you can bump people up. You can't drag somebody into knowledge. They have to discover it on their own. There's really no way to teach anybody anything, and there I mean at the being level. Being level has to come from experience and has to develop from the inside out. It can't get pushed into somebody from the outside in. So it's just the nature of the reality that we're in.
Okay, let me insert another question here.
You're not doing too well on your list of questions, I bet.
But I don't mind.
Probably a tenth of the way down your list.
I don't mind at all, because your conversation is really interesting. So, but let's move on a little bit here, because there are three things I'd like to tie in. Tom just said that he talked to spiritual people who were kind of disencouraged, and Neil talked about the separation of people or who have separating experiences, the way they experience the world. And for that, I'd like to move into the next question, which is divergent trends in the world. With the internet, we have the possibility that people can more easily create their own reality bubble. They can have their own reality, their own TV show, their own radio show, their own website, their own blog. So it's a lot more easy now to create our own reality bubble. And on the other hand, many people do not believe anymore in the mainstream story of reality, and because it just makes less and less sense. So my question here is, while we have these diverging trends on one hand, will a convergence of ideas and concepts have to happen on the level of the intellect, or might the convergence happen on a transcendental level, or on a being level, as Tom would say, and the mind does not even has to grasp that the solution is being worked out here without him arranging all the details? So how important is a left brain convergence of our worldviews in order to create a solution for the global challenges we have ahead? And that would be maybe to Neil first and then to Tom.
I think there's quite a number of parts to that question, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's deal with left brain, right brain. I understand, strictly speaking, that it's not quite as simple as that if you speak to people who work in these fields, but we understand, don't we, that in principle, the left brain is really to do with logic and the right brain is to do with creativity. The left brain is linear and the right brain is more kind of non-linear and spontaneous and so on. It's funny because I know people who are very, very, very left brain, and I also know people who are very, very, very right brain, and they excel, of course, in certain things. So if you've got, like, let's take someone who we all know, like, say, the artist Van Gogh as a right brainer, produces stunning creative work, but can't kind of conduct himself, can't eat properly, has lots of problems, can't string sentences together too well, and his exposure to the energy that we might say is exemplified in the right brain is at the cost, is sacrifices his left brain stuff. I do think that we have to understand that there's a certain equilibrium that becomes advantageous on the spiritual path. A lot of it is about poise, really. In the book I've just written, I kind of use the words like poise and grace and elegance and stuff like that quite a lot. And I think it's a little bit like the difference between how, let's say, a deer the animal, a deer moves through a forest, and how a tourist moves through a forest. And if you watch how a deer moves, it has a certain balance of skill, of logic, of integration with its environment. It doesn't necessarily consider itself as entirely separate from what's going on around it. Whereas a human who moves through a forest does consider itself separate, really. So you might be the cleverest survivalist in the world with all these special skills and knowledge of how to build shelters and start fires, and these particular leaves do these things. But if you consider yourself separate from that environment, to some extent, you're always going to be at a disadvantage. And I think that's what I learn every day, really, from animals, which is their integration into the reality around them is more complete, is more profound, and they can, ebb and flow in and out of it as necessary. And one particular, how can I put it, a sage that I used to know, who would decrease his visibility, let's say, if the skill of doing that was to become part of the environment, not look like part of it, but actually become it. And I think that kind of skill is not possible, that level of integration at a very physical level is not possible when you polarize your consciousness to either linear or non-linear. I think there's a certain appropriateness, and there's a certain point to being in the so-called physical world, which is to understand the relationship between being a flesh and blood and bone animal and being a spiritual entity, being an experience of consciousness, being a divine emanation. And I think that a lot of that is to do with collapsing polarity and integrating positive and negative and understanding how that plays out in life. So just as in the mechanics of time with cause and effect shows you how consciousness changes the environment and the being itself, so when you use polarity as a teaching mechanism, which is a very powerful, attractive force on Earth in the physical realm, there comes a point on your awakening process, which may take thousands of years over many parallel lives, in my view. There comes a point where you start to address the reconciliation of positive and negative, of organized and together and disparate and dissimilar and distributed, and you start to understand that is a position of consciousness, it's a certain configuration of consciousness. And for me, for example, it's not appropriate to say, oh, well, I'm a philosophical type person, so don't expect me to do that spreadsheet because I'm not brilliant with numbers. I'm good with concepts and abstract thoughts and big, deep things. So, I can't fill that form out, that insurance form. I can't. That's not my thing. I'm not doing that. I don't think that's appropriate. I think that a spiritual man is a Renaissance man. It is somebody who necessarily is multidisciplined in what they can do. They have a number of different faculties that naturally become enlivened as you go about your business. I knew a martial arts teacher in Spain, and he had been practicing the inner arts of martial arts, and as an example of his discipline, and you can make of this what you will, somebody once handed him a guitar and he said, oh, I don't play the guitar. And they said, oh, right, sorry, I thought you did. He says, no, I play the, something else, the piano or something. He said, but let me try and just play guitar. And they handed it to him, and he just started playing really brilliantly and beautifully, and he'd never picked one up in his life before. And then he put it down, and they said to that person, well, I thought you said you didn't play. He says, I don't. He said, but I just got myself out of the way of that and just played guitar. And it's the same, I've told a similar story with shooting as well, with target shooting, which I'm quite fond of. if you shoot with a bullet or an arrow and think about what you're doing, you're a lousy shot. It doesn't work too well. But the body kind of knows how to do it. The body knows how to accurately send a projectile through the air to a certain point in space and time. It knows how to do it. And the mind really kind of gets in the way of that. And so, the whole thing of archery and of pistol shooting or whatever is fascinating because it's a very immediate lesson in the relationship between the body and the mind and the environment, and the logic and the creativity and the environment, because logic says that a lot of the things about shooting shouldn't be, and yet they are. And you soon learn that when you stood there and you pull the trigger and obviously nanoseconds later there's like a hole in a target 50 yards in front of you, or you pull the bow and you release the arrow. You soon know how that's going. It doesn't take very long for you to assess how that's occurring. And when you do it, you start to realize why, like, our forefathers put so much store, particularly in archery, because we can trace that back a lot further. You start to realize why all these Japanese and Chinese guys were interested in that, because it's a brilliant teaching mechanism to show you the relationship between the two sides of your brain and the ways of approaching the world. And for me, it is a temptation, and it is something that I'm susceptible to drift off into mental or intellectual realms. So I have to make sure to some extent that doesn't happen. So I use the natural environment for that very often. And right now, living in Oregon, I'm kind of near rivers and forests and mountains and stuff. So it's excellent because I can go into Portland, which is this, really nice, progressive, cool, interesting city, or to Seattle or whatever, which is, again, a great city. Or I can go into Sasquatch wilderness with just, the kind of place where if you walk too far, you could just wander off and get lost and die of exposure, which I find very fascinating and exciting. I like that because it puts you in touch with something that in the city you don't necessarily see, which is, controlling your own beingness with your own mortality is a very real question. So I think tuning yourself to different environments begins to show you how necessary it is to be able to modulate left brain and right brain thinking. And to some extent, you could say being in a city and being in the wilderness are nice expressions of that. So yeah, that would be my response to your question.
Okay, Tom, any additions?
Well, maybe a few. I would agree that there's really three things here that are good to do. One, it's good to have a very well-developed left brain. Two, it's good to have a very well-developed right brain. But more important, it's very good to have both of those integrated into one whole being. And by integrated, I mean, it's not that you do these left brain things and then you do those right brain things and there's like separate parts of you, separate things that don't overlap. They need to overlap completely. You need to be both left-brained and right-brained simultaneously, kind of all the time. You need to see the world in as a whole that way. And I agree that if you are unbalanced to the right, then your world is skewed and you don't learn as much as you should. If you're unbalanced to the left, the exact same thing is true. You need to be whole as a being and exercise all of your brain. Of course, since I know that this is a virtual reality, I have to tell you that you don't have really a brain. That's just a virtual thing. But anyway, it's a metaphor we'll work with here. But I think both are important. And if we look at progress, if we look at where we might be going over the next 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 decades and so on, we see that we live in a Western culture, and in Western culture, science has become the high priests. They're the ones that tell us what to think, what's true and what's not true, just like the priests used to tell people in more primitive cultures what to believe and what not to believe. So the high priests of Western culture are scientists, And in general, our culture tends to be very left brain dominant. We find the value in analytical thinking and distrust intuitive thinking. So that's kind of just the nature of our culture. So I think the approach, at least my approach has been, in writing my books, the reason I wrote them the way I did, because I am both a scientist and a mystic. I'm left brain and right brain, and I've done all the mystic things and have those experiences and see the world that way in its holistic approach. And at the same time, I'm a scientist, and I work in that way as well, and see the logical approach. But I think what we will need to help that balance is that we need to start. I need to start. I don't know that everybody needs to do their own thing, but my process in this is to help the people who are left brain dominant get a more balanced picture. And I started there. I aim my book at these people in particularly because they're the deciders of policy. They're the movers and shakers. They're the lawyers and doctors and Indian chiefs and architects and builders and so on. They're the people that influence. And if they can understand a bigger picture, and not again that you push one down their throat, but that you give them opportunity to see something that resonates within them and kind of opens them to a little bigger picture, I think that is a kind of an important way to go about being part of the solution in our world. Now, it's not necessarily a good thing to do in other cultures, other places, other times, but right now, I see that we have to have the scientists turn that corner and realize that reality is not that objective place that they thought it was. If we can get the scientists to make that turn to say that, yes, this physical reality is just a piece of something larger, then that will help a whole lot of those other people who now basically turn away from anything that says that. They will start to embrace it. They will start to be able now to get something out of these demonstrations we were talking about. They will be able to process that information, whereas right now they cannot. So I'm very hopeful that science is headed in that direction. We're seeing a lot more open-mindedness out on the fringe in science. Of course, the center is as closed-minded and as belief-trapped as ever, but we're seeing more of it out on the fringe. I think that if we can move that left brain dominant attitude to be a little more open-minded, to see a little bigger picture of their reality, and not really through demonstration, because I don't think that's really the way that it's going to go. I think we're going to lead those left brain people to the larger reality through their left brain into the right brain. We're going to make it make sense, make it rational, make it logical that the larger reality does exist, and that this reality is virtual and small and not really what life is all about. So that's, I see the two progressively coming more together as we as a species learn to find more balance, that it doesn't have to be this polarity of right against left, scientists against philosopher, the atheist against the religious. We kind of define ourselves in terms of these polarities, and all of that, of course, is counterproductive to moving toward being a whole person. So I don't know if that really is pertinent to your question or not, but so I think the left brain, right brain is just, we have to kind of outgrow that polarity and grow into a whole being with a whole perspective that is both logical and at the same time mystical. And those two are not contradictory. Those two can be synthesized together as one bigger picture of the nature of reality. And I think that's kind of where we need to go. But of course, it'll be a long trip getting there. It just is hopefully where we're migrating towards.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it is about integration. A question for you, Oliver. Having had many travels in your beautiful land, would you say that Germany is one of the most left-brain oriented countries in Europe?
Well, I've not been to that many countries. I've been to France and to Italy, and from the countries that I have visited, I can definitely say Germany is definitely the most left-brain country there is.
That is the correct answer, Oliver. Well done. That is the correct answer. It is particularly left-brain oriented, and I've worked in like the quotes business world in Germany with Germans. And I've also enjoyed in my previous life some of their fantastic automobile engineering in various guises. But also, I have noted that, on your website, you can get like a map with little flags in where people come from. That there's a distinct absence in certain parts of the world, and one of those is Germany. And I don't think it's a language thing. I think it's cultural. And so a lot of people often say to me, why do you think that people interested in consciousness and spirituality and metaphysics, why are they mainly British and American people? I think that's a very interesting question. And of course, language does play into that, because if you're Russian, you might be supremely interested in all these things. But if you haven't learned English, you're going to be on the back foot a little bit, unless you've got all your Google translation technology and whatnot. But I do think that there's definitely countries in Europe where, in Scandinavian countries as well, having discussed this briefly with Henrik Palmgren, who I think you probably both know who he is. He is very much like laughing when I say that about his, homeland of Sweden. And it's the same, really, in a lot of places that the left brain is given prominence. And I think it's okay that, but like you say, it can lead to really an overcompensation in the other direction. So I think like the New Age movement is an overcompensation, really, for the sort of drabness of scientific imperialism, really. And a lot of New Agers are just as bad in a way. And having been round sort of Glastonbury in England, which is a lovely, lovely little town, but there's a lot of people dancing about and really disowning their own life and their own responsibilities, and not really focusing on growth and on integrity and authenticity and empowerment. They're really creating a world to escape into where everything's kind of like, safe and bouncy and lovely and supportive, which is, obviously that's very attractive to people who are having a challenging time. But it's an escape. They're creating a virtual world to run off into. So I think it's interesting when you see a very logical place like Germany. Whenever somebody in fact, having said all that, I was giving this workshop in October, and one of the guys there was from Germany, and he was the most mystical kind of character I've met for a long time, actually. But that kind of proves the point that I'm making, which is, if it swings too far to one polarity, the temptation is that there'll be like a catapult from there to the other polarity. And of course, as Thomas pointed out, the sweet spot, really, the point of it is to not consider them as opposites necessarily, but to consider them as parts of one whole. So for me, I have ceased really to think of it as like, well, that's logical and that's illogical, or that's creative and that's non-creative. They're just really different configurations of energy. They're just different ways of putting information together and proposing that as a thing, an idea, or a tree, or a ball, or a glass of water, or whatever. They're just different ways of proposing things. And of course, we do have aptitudes and natural skills in certain areas. Some people are good with one set of configurations, some people are good with another. But I do think that there is, at some point, a realization that you have to become proficient in all those areas. And a lot of people who have listened to my stuff have kind of come up to me afterwards and said, you know what I like is that you're kind of very rational and reasonable and logical about what you do, which is funny because I don't think I am at all, really. And they say, you know, in the New Age movement, we need that. We need a bit of discipline, and we need a bit of reason and a bit of philosophical penetration. And again, I'm not saying, oh well, thank you, you know, that's great, but I'm thinking, well, that isn't my conception of this at all. But you're talking to someone who's found themselves polarized in the other world, so to some extent, I feel some sort of kinship with Thomas in that you do realize that you have to sometimes take it upon yourself to create this little bridge and say, well, I'm nothing special, but I can operate in both realms. I can be scientific and I can be mystical. I can be philosophical. I can talk about emotions and sexuality, and I can also talk about ultra-terrestrials and paranormal. I realize that there's a totality here, and approaching those subjects, really, you're talking about one thing. You're talking about, once more, one truth. And I'm comfortable in walking multiple terrains to get to that space, if you like. And I think that is what perhaps connects us to Oliver. And maybe that's, I don't know what your view is, because obviously you thought, well, here's person A and here's person B. It might be interesting to get them together. I think that is interesting, and I think it is important, and I think a lot of people are starting to realize that in their own life. You can't escape into the New Age realm, and you can't satisfy yourself in your kind of scientific tower and just look down upon everything and think, haha, yes, I've got it all mapped out and measured and quantified and everything's cool. I think both of those people, again, hand on heart in the electric chair of truth, realize that they've gone too far one way. And I think it is beholden to us personally in our own way. And again, I like how Tom puts it in that I don't know about anyone else, but personally for me, I know that it would be easy for me to just escape in my little study with books on the shelf and, you know, wear my old tweed jacket and smoke a pipe and just read all these fantastic 19th century books and just think, this is great, you know, and just live in an intellectual landscape. That would be easy for me, and I'd enjoy that, quite frankly. But it wouldn't be authentic, and it wouldn't really be fulfilling. It would be an escape. And I think that everybody sort of knows that. So spirituality does compel you to find your equilibrium and your integration point. And when you stand there ceases to be polarization, because when you stand at the center, that whole thing collapses. So the whole point of negativity and positivity, of construction and destruction, is to lead you to the center point, to lead you to the center of your own being. And from there, then you start to engage with, you know, what we might call your ascendance, or you know, being able to positively deconstruct the reality around you to get to ultimate reality, to see what that is. You can only really do that from the center point. So that's my view on this.
Okay. So when I look at the clock, we are almost at the 2-hour mark. So I would suggest that I will take my list of questions and maybe keep it for part 2.
Why not?
Because I really enjoyed it, and I think there's still some interesting topics that we could discuss, but I think we should keep it under 2 hours, because if anybody starts listening in and sees this is longer than 2 hours, then probably a lot of people would just skip it and say, I don't even have the time for that. So we should stick to the limit. And so coming to the end, I would suggest that both of you should just briefly give your contact information, your websites, so that anybody who listened in knows where to look to find out more about you. Maybe Tom, you can start.
Okay. The books that I have written are a trilogy of books called My Big Toe. You can find them for free on Google Books. You can find them in Amazon. You can find them in Barnes & Noble, at your bookstore, or at the website www.mybigtoe.com. And if you are interested in watching rather than reading, I suggest you go to YouTube. And if you Google Thomas Campbell, you'll get the YouTube site. If you go to the YouTube site and search on TWCJR44, you will get to that website, and there are, I don't know how many, but lots and lots of videos there. Some of them only 10 and 15 minutes long. Some of them are an hour and a half long. Some of them are series that go like 14 hours if you have that sort of stamina. But I would suggest that people, if they really are interested and want to know more about the theory, the science, and the metaphysics and how it all works together, go to YouTube would be a good introduction, and listen to the Calgary workshop. It's a series of lectures. They were given on a Friday, a Saturday, and a Sunday, and it would be good if you listen to them in that order. I suspect just take it in small bites, 20 minutes at a time or half hour at a time is plenty. It'd be too much to swallow all at once. But those would be the places to go. Also, on that website, www.mybigtoe.com, there's a forum. And on that forum, there are lots of people who are very grown up and understand these things. They're good people to talk with. I'm on there every once in a while and answer questions. There's also a Facebook site that is active that you can reach by putting my name in. So those are the ways to access more information. And if you're interested in talks or where I'm going to be giving workshops or that sort of thing, then go to www.mbtevents.com. And there's some people that run that site that basically do my organization and kind of keep track of where I'm supposed to be when, and make sure I get there on time and am prepared. So that's about it as far as more information, where to go and where to look.
Okay, Neil, go ahead.
Yeah, if you go to www.neilkramer.com, that's my main website, and most things are available from there. There's a store with DVDs and audio books and whatnot, events schedule on there, also details of my teaching stroke consultation work is on there, and I have a book coming out in May called The Unfoldment. So details of that will appear there. It's already on pre-order actually at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and what have you. But yeah, neilkramer.com, all the main information is there.
Okay, so Neil, Tom, thanks a lot for the time you invested today. I enjoyed it greatly. There were a lot of deep thoughts and a lot to listen to again to really absorb everything, because when I did the latest interview with Tom, it was only when I listened to it the second time that I really grasped everything that was said. So I think there's, again, a lot to grasp from listening to it the second time. So thanks again.
You're quite welcome. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with Neil and yourself, Oliver. It's always fun.
Yeah, similarly, thanks very much. It's great to talk to you guys, Thomas and Oliver, and thanks, Oliver, for taking the time and putting this together, and hopefully we've created some compelling listening for the guys and girls out there. I hope they enjoy it.
Yeah, I hope so too.
But Neil said, my perspective, the way I come to it, is from a different direction, but certainly, as I'm fond of saying, there is but one truth, but there are many, many paths that lead to that one truth, and many, many ways to see that one truth, many perspectives of that one truth. So I agree with Neil. Our physical rules, fluid, are constant. We have to realize that, and this you will find is all in consonance with Neil's discussion. We have to realize that there are more than just physical rules. There are rules that deal with our physical reality, and generally, the science tries to dig these rules out and discover what they are. And they provide the structure for this reality frame. They provide we can say the rules. I call it the rule set, but it's the structure. You can't have a reality frame that's constantly changing. Like, one day you walk on water and one day you can't, as Neil was saying, and that sometimes things fall up, sometimes things fall down. And that would not be a very effective reality frame for consciousness to experience in. So you need rules of how things will work. Energy exchanges basically define the rule set. And those rules are kind of given, if you will, in the sense that this reality frame has evolved based on those rules. So we are a product of those kinds of what we would say physical rules, how this physical reality works. But besides that, there are rules of consciousness, if you will. There are non-physical rules as well as physical rules. And because this physical reality is not the fundamental reality. The fundamental reality is consciousness. The physical reality is just a virtual reality created within consciousness to provide us a place to learn, to grow, to experience, to evolve the quality of our being. So it gives us a schoolhouse for growing up. But there are some rules that have to do with consciousness as well. For instance, one of the rules of consciousness is that you, in many ways, create your own reality. And you do this in several ways. You do it through interpretation. You are consciousness imagining you're in a physical reality, not a physical being imagining that you have a consciousness.
For today's interview, we have not only one, but two guests. On one end of the line, we have Neil Kramer, who is a philosopher, a mystic, and a lifelong truth seeker, which made him look into a large variety of subjects concerning the mystery of life. He was set on this path at an early age through several paranormal experiences, which made him question whether there isn't more to reality compared to what most people believe it to be. After a convincing demonstration of how reality can be tweaked, which Neil witnessed during his teenage years, he was hooked on figuring out what's really going on. He shares his insights through lectures, interviews, personal consultations, and his soon-to-be-released first book, The Unfoldment. On the other end of the line, we have Thomas Campbell, a physicist who got interested into researching and exploring human consciousness. In the early 70s, Tom came into contact with Bob Monroe, a TV and radio show producer interested in out-of-body experiences. Bob taught Tom how his consciousness can deliberately leave his body, and Tom started to map out the realms he found himself in with the scientific mindset he was trained to use as a physicist. Over the last 30 years, Tom developed his my big toe theory, a model of reality that unites physics and metaphysics and can explain the normal as well as the paranormal. Besides writing his My Big Toe trilogy, Tom gives lectures and workshops to share his insights. So, Tom and Neil, is there anything that should be added to your introduction, or shall we jump right into the first question?
Oh, let's get right into it.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. So the first question is for Neil, and it relates to physical laws. Are they rigid or fluid? That's the topic. According to Tom's My Big Toe theory, the physical laws developed as part of the rule set of this virtual reality that we are living in. So according to Tom, the physical laws are part of the evolutionary process and not a never-changing constant. If we look at Rupert Sheldrake for a minute, he developed his morphic field theory, and according to Rupert, physical laws are more like habits of nature, so they can change over long periods of time. So my question to you is, how flexible are our physical laws and those constants of nature really when we look at history in the really long term? And if these constants are actually more flexible than we currently think, what are the implications of this for our currently extrapolation backwards to the time of the Big Bang?
Wow,
In
that's
25
this realm. And of course, depending on your mindset, I know that Thomas will probably be more familiar with the works of David Bohm than I am, so I'm not going to try and expound all his stuff, but certainly from a physics point of view, I think that was grasped a long time ago in the 20s and 30s, and certain people have started to create bridges between those two worlds. My personal journey has been a sort of mystical one, really. And I kind of like went there by a different route, although I think the essential foundations of it are rather similar. And being familiar with some of the principles of Thomas's work, I think we probably share the idea that this 3D realm is really a developmental realm, and it's a place to kind of hone skills and to learn and to put oneself in a teaching environment where you start to understand the power of consciousness and how it can be used to create. But it has to be done in a very specific way, in a very specific realm. And so I think the laws of physics contain that until appropriate for me. So most people are subject to those, just as a hard scientist would insist that everybody is. The only difference in my perception is I wouldn't say everybody is. I say everybody is until appropriate, and then they start to bend, and then they start to change a little bit. But I think that is a very advanced state of being, and although it's open to everybody, it's a developmental marker rather than any sort of like ultimate final destination. It's to say, well, now you start to see the physics change a little bit. There's a certain responsibility comes with that, which is you don't need to go running around waving your arms in the air, or going on stage and showing it to audiences. It's a new mountain peak that's come into view, and as you go to it, unsurprisingly, as soon as you get there, you see an even bigger mountain range in the distance, and on it goes. So that would be my outline answer for you, Oliver. So I'll put that back over to you, and let's see what you think about that, and obviously let's get Thomas's feedback too.
Yeah, I think let's answer Tom first.
Well, of course, I agree with everything that words are less.
Fantastic first question. Well, I think that Tom's right, that the laws are there for a reason, and they're there to help in a way. And there is a certain immutable quality to them, because it's all very well talking in abstract terms about how physics can be easily bent and stuff, but then try walking across the surface of the river, or try putting a bullet in your brain and see how well you do. So there are physical laws there for a reason. I'm also quite fond of Sheldrake's morphic field resonance and so on, and I get what he's saying with that, and I think that's interesting as well. The way I perceive it is that this, what I call the third density experience, this realm that we find ourselves in, is it's a means of showing the effects of consciousness in a temporal zone, basically. So the whole mechanism of cause and effect, to a large extent, is to say, well, rather than having instant manifestation, rather than having consciousness absolutely sculpt things around and mold the clay lightning fast as it might do in a dream or in a higher density experience, let's see what happens where time is put into the equation, into this realm, because that shows you from a very clockwork point of view what your consciousness does to the environment, to the people, to the other consciousness around you. And as you begin to conduct that, as you begin to purify your vessel for channeling consciousness, is how I would put it personally, you start to see an increase and a potency in your conscious experiences. And from that first hint at thinking, well, what I feel and think and how I resonate does seem to have a subtle effect on the world around me, that first inclination begins to grow, and you realize that it's not subtle, it's actually very profound, but your perceptive apparatus is filtered against that. If you've been brought up in a Western materialist cultural paradigm, And as you begin to create this stillness, and as you begin to cultivate these techniques for moving your consciousness to a different state, you start to grasp the depth of penetration of how consciousness is woven into.
For it, derived from the brain. It's the truth of the matter is just the opposite. You are consciousness, and you are imagining that you're living in this physical reality. So you interpret this reality in terms of your own experience, your own history. You get data. You think you get data through your senses, but basically you're getting data from a data stream into your consciousness that you interpret as this reality frame, but you interpret it personally. So we can change our reality just by changing how we interpret the data that comes to us. That's one way. We can change our reality because this larger consciousness system we're a part of is moved by intent. Intent is the fundamental motive force, if you will, within consciousness. And your intent modifies the probability of what is likely to happen next. So we create our own our reality in that way. We influence what happens next. But of course, what happens next, for the most part, will fall within those physical rules that we discussed, but not always. There are exceptions, and those rules kind of apply in general. When you get down and measure them, they'll always be there, but it doesn't mean that you can't. Some people say hack the system a little bit. You can do that. So we also create our own reality based on our interactions with others, how we act. Neil was making this point, how we interact, how we approach things, whether we approach from fear and ego or whether we approach from love and caring and no fear, no ego. We come from the caring side, the compassionate side. Then we change the reality around us. We interact with others. We help them see things differently. We help the whole reality frame change because of us. So the individual unit of consciousness is the fundamental thing. It is consciousness. It's in a state of evolving, growing up, becoming love. That's its purpose and point for being here. And the physical rules, though they aren't going to change much, they can change some based on